Hello and welcome to Unparliamentary Language, a podcast that, like Plato, they say, could stick it away half a crate of whiskey every day. And we're going into one of our silly season specials here. I have very little idea what's going to happen this episode because Rob is going to try and teach me some political philosophy. So I think, Rob, we'll just go straight into it. Take it away.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to be your philosophical guide. This is something that I studied in university a long time ago and is one of the things I really love about politics because you get to talk about it and you don't have to mention like Labour or the Conservatives, and we barely have to mention Brexit in this podcast. So although I'm sure analogies...
Except for that time where you mentioned it. But I think you got away with it.
Thank you. Apart from where sometimes we'll like draw analogies from it. So yeah, so today we're going to talk about Plato and Aristotle, and we're going to talk about politics in like very, very broad terms, which is what I like. You can do some state building. You can get into some sort of crazy tangents about what you would do with a state, or if you agree with Plato and Aristotle or not, and their ideas. And what I think is really fascinating about political philosophy, particularly when you're looking at the ones we're going to look at today, people from ancient Greece, it's amazing how some of those principles are still sort of reflected in our politics today and still influence it in such a big way. So without further ado, let's jump in to Plato. So apart from knowing that Plato could stick it away half a crate of whiskey every day, what else do you know about Plato, the man himself?
This is where I'm going to get all my Greek philosophers confused. So he's not the guy who does questions. That's Socrates.
Mm-hmm.
Or Socrates, as the famous philosophers Bill and Ted Esquire once called him. No, so Plato, my knowledge of Plato, I'm just going to look him up now and see if I can remember any, see what I've kind of got there. Oh, yeah, he was famously Aristotle's teacher. That I knew there was some kind of link. And I suppose he must be related to the Platonic ideal because that's his name. Like, kind of the idea, like, we have the phrase Platonic relationships, right? Like, so, like, there was a kind of thing about whether he was sleeping with his students and so on, but he was kind of like, no, not really, we're just, like, mates.
Yeah, basically. I don't think he took those ideas into politics as much, but yeah, he certainly did a lot of thinking on the side. And when you mentioned about Socrates or Socrates, he employs the Socratic method in his works, which means basically when he writes it down, Plato's ideas come through this little story that is Socrates debating with people in like Athenian parliament, essentially. The whole basis of these dialogues or the Socratic method is Socrates has an idea, somebody tells him that they don't agree with that idea, and Socrates explains why they're wrong. And then that's it. So like the message of these little stories is like Socrates is always right, and this is why you do it. So we're not going to do maybe we'll have our own Socratic dialogue tonight, but hopefully you will disagree with me and disagree with Plato. These are ideas that were like controversial even in their own time. I guess philosophers are there to provoke a reaction. They're there to talk about the ideals in society and maybe not have the most pragmatic approach. And Plato in particular is all about the ideal. There's a very famous picture that I can't remember where it is. It's in one of the London museums that depicts Plato and Aristotle together in this like Athenian parliament, and Plato's pointing up and Aristotle's pointing down. I'm sure you can find that picture as well with sort of like Plato balancing a basketball on the end of his finger, just like spinning it around. Somebody's edited it like that. But Plato's all about, like, it's about the ideal, it's what's greater. And what we're going to talk about tonight is what makes the ideal state. So, sort of like by state, we mean, like, country.
I assume, like, country as opposed to, I really like being a gas.
Yeah, exactly. So we're going to talk about that sort of state, and I'll briefly talk about the one that he was in at the time. So, Plato was active in Athenian politics, and Athens we think of as the birthplace of democracy. So you'd think that Plato would kind of be arguing that democracy is the best way to rule. But in fact, he argues that it's the most imperfect method of ruling a society and comes up with his own. So if I was to ask you, Tom, what some of the problems are with democracy, what would you come up with?
Well, so I think we can, and here we go. Hey, Brexit. I think the thing is like, there's the famous quote with democracy of democracy depends on a well-informed and educated citizenry, and that is definitely true. So if you can, if like demagoguery and things like that can take control of democracy in a way that is not the you have the same flaws with any system. Like if you have a dictator, someone gets the ear of the dictator, then they can influence the dictator. But also, presumably, if someone's a dictator, they surround themselves with people who agree with their ideas, which, while that may not be good for the general population, like it's good for the ideas of the dictator, in that you would like to think. Of course, inevitably that falls down because dictators tend to either get stabbed in the back or go, fully into their rabbit hole of like yes men and do stupid stuff. But yeah, I mean, like democracy is open to being, if people can control the information the masses get, then they can control the democracy, and therefore, you can have situations where, like we talk about all the time, stuff in the media, like essentially blatant lies in a lot of newspapers, to try and put forward their agenda, because the people vote, the people see the newspapers, the people act on what they think is true based on the newspapers. What else is bad with democracy? You can have someone put in charge of something who doesn't have any knowledge of that area. So you could vote in someone based on the popular vote and put them in charge of, say, the NHS, and they could never have had any experience of being in the NHS. So that's an example of something that democracy doesn't do great. What are the other kind of big problems? I suppose another problem you can have with democracy, which is kind of like, I mean, I suppose you might argue this is not necessarily a direct flaw of democracy, but like you could elect a dictator type person through a democracy, and then they could be like, aha, now I'm in charge and I've taken everything over without them having to do it by force. But I feel like that's kind of like the system breaking down as opposed to necessarily a direct flaw of democracy itself. That's like saying revolution is a flaw of dictatorship. Yeah. Yeah.
No, that's not a bad point. And like both Plato and Aristotle will pick up on those points about which regime is the best for keeping stability within a state. So they do take that into consideration and think, right, is democracy the best one to keep everybody on side, or is there another one? So to go back to Plato and his sort of criticisms of democracy. So first of all, he says democracy allows for excessive freedom, which sounds a bit bizarre in our day and age, because I think the idea of excessive freedom might be a little bit alien to us who live in a Western liberal democracy where the ideas of freedom of speech and individualism are sort of pressed to their very core nature. That's what being part of democracy is all about. Plato says that essentially democracy allows people just to do whatever they want, and it becomes kind of like an anarchic society if everybody's working in what he calls self-interest. So Plato is ultimately obsessed with the idea of justice and what makes a good state. And a good state is one that acts in the common good of all of its citizens, rather than one that acts with people just being self-interested about their own desires and goals. So, for example, Plato thinks that the ideal society would be one where all citizens are treated, where all citizens have the same benefits from the state. It's worth pointing out at this point that the ancient Greek view of citizen differs from our own view of citizen. They had slaves. Women were never really considered to have a vote there. So there's a lot of caveats to Plato's argument. But still, he thinks that it's one where democracy is, only really, it fosters a culture where people act in their own self-interest. One of the reasons why this happens is because Plato essentially sees equality as being a bad thing, which is, again, kind of bizarre.
It's quite a different concept to how we see things nowadays.
Yeah, precisely. So to get you into the mind of Plato and why he says that equality makes everybody think that they have an equal skill and a right to rule. And this is kind of tying into your point about people who run the NHS without having been in the NHS, okay? He says that that means that any Tom, Dick or Harry off the street can say, I can run the NHS because it's my right to do so. I have an equal right. And he said that's not what ruling is about. If you have a society that's based on equality and that way, then the only people who are going to come into politics are those who seek power and those who want power for power's sake. And in particular, these individuals in themselves are open to corruption. I think, again, you mentioned it, that in a democracy, the general populace is open to being, swung by the media or misrepresentation of other things in society. And they all play on ways of corrupting the ideal of the state, making people stop thinking about what's good for the state as a whole, and they start thinking about what works best in their interest. And that allows them to elect people who, although they might serve a selfish interest, would actually put the goal of the state at risk. Does that all make sense?
Yeah, I think I get the general concept.
Yeah. And again, like we can apply that to like modern day scenarios, like you were with, certain votes being swayed by people, by the media, by newspapers running certain articles on things, saying that, this group of people is bad, therefore, like negative media that makes you think, oh goodness, I want to vote for that person for my personal safety, even if it means that the country looks a bit worse off. It also says that the kind of, if we're talking about individuals, and I'm going to use our other subject that we usually talk about in the podcast, but like Trump, I think Trump is a really good example of somebody who maybe came to power for power's sake and did it in his own interest. And Plato, although he admits that sometimes democracy gets it right and you can get good leaders through this system, and people who, sometimes people will like a popular person who puts the state first, this is too open to chance and consequence. And as soon as you've got one, you can replace them with somebody who's really awful instead.
It's interesting because that's often kind of a similar criticism is often levelled at the idea of monarchy. So, like, we currently have our queen. She's pretty good at doing all the queenly duties, which are not, obviously that's been divested from what the state does. I mean, it's kind of there are formal functions involving the queen, but the actual day-to-day of the state is democracy. But you have people talking about, again, not wanting to talk about the Brexit party, but Nigel Farage has gone on a rant in the news recently about the monarchy, and but people talk about, we don't want this person to become the next king or whatever, people often talk about it tends to be more of a joke with Prince Charles. I think people have got used to Prince Charles as he's aged, but people always tend to joke, the Queen will live forever and then he won't get to be king or whatever, that kind of thing. But you definitely have we have George III, who famously had mental health issues. But lived to a ripe old age. So during that time, he was still ruling the country. Yeah, so you kind of get a similar argument leveled against things like monarchy, where you can have a good king, but of course you can have a bad king or a bad queen. It's interesting that the argument sounds very similar, but leveled at democracy.
Yeah, and I think you have to remember that Plato is living in a time where he's probably seen lots of good rulers and bad rulers roll through Athens, and thinks that other people could do the job better. And I'll move on to what he talks about how he sees society being organized and how you eliminate all those problems of what you quite rightly picked out are the problems with monarchy, and how you sometimes get good leaders and bad leaders. So I'll quickly move on to how Plato sees society being ordered, and then which sort of class of people he thinks are basically the best to rule. So Plato splits society into three essential pieces. I think this is really interesting because throughout history and even in our modern democracy, we tend to split society into three pieces as well. You would say sort of lower class, middle class, upper class, particularly in British politics. That's dominated our mindset for the past 200 years, or for as long as we had a parliament. So Plato splits it up into the noble, which is sort of your kings, your aristocracy, or their equivalent in ancient Greece. The rich, which would be seen as merchants. They're your middle class. They're the people who are running the economy but have no sort of noble status, and the poor, which make up sort of the majority of people. He essentially says that this should be redefined slightly and that you should have, the people should be split very clearly into 3 roles. So the poor will be your producers. They'll be the people who man the farms. They'll be the people who fish. They'll keep everybody alive. Then your middle class, he twists that slightly and says this should be a group of warriors. This should be like an army class. If you want to defend your state against aggressors, if you want to have a strong state, then you need a strong military to support that. So you will have a class of warriors. And then right at the top, you've got the noble, or what he says, they're the rulers. And Plato is really rigid in these classes and basically says, if you're a producer for life. You don't become a warrior. You've never got a chance of ruling because, he says it would be bizarre. Like, imagine if the king walked down to your farm and tried to grow some crops. He'd be rubbish at it. He doesn't know how to grow crops. He doesn't come from generations of people who are growing crops. You wouldn't make him do that. Equally, if you had a warrior and you made him the ruler, then that allows, you'd have a very war-based nation. You'd be Sparta, essentially, where you'd be looking for the next battle. So he basically says, stick to your role and let the noble people, the rulers, be in charge. Now, I can imagine you've got a couple of things to say about that state of affairs. What's your initial thought on that?
I think that's kind of a very... One would say it's quite a traditional view of things, but I feel like it is a view that in European countries, at least, has held until fairly recently. Until this kind of current age of democracy as we see it, where there was the idea that, like you say, we have the class system in the UK, and there was always the idea that there was the working class who were the workers, and and that kind of idea of you would have tradition. Tradition is important, so a family of farmers will be good at farming was the kind of logic there. I think most people nowadays would disagree with that because I suppose one of the fundamental things with the way we view democracy is that not only should everyone have the equal chance to try everything, to do anything if they so choose, as long as it's legal. Not only should they have the opportunity to try all the things, because we understand that you can basically teach anyone any skill, right? Short of having some kind of physical limitation, most people could, if you train someone up to be a runner, they will become a runner eventually because I think there used to be this kind of idea that it was all entirely genetic, and don't get me wrong, some people have a bit of an edge because, they've come from a family who've always been runners or whatever. We do see kind of differences between in long distance running between nations and so on, but that's it's not necessarily with enough backing and money you can seemingly make anyone a good sportsman. So that kind of idea is very opposite to this idea that you kind of stay in your rigid roles. And I suppose it's probably one of the things we talk about. We talk about freedom, it used to be kind of the jokes you get in Monty Python sketches where oh, my son's gone off to London and he's no longer a miner and stuff like that. And we've always been miners, even though they were probably only mining for 100 years. But nowadays, I think most people would be very accepting of the idea that your children can do whatever and aren't going to do what their parents did necessarily.
Yeah, precisely. This is very sort of anti-social mobility, I guess. And there just weren't the opportunities back then, or they weren't fostered in the same way. This is, I would argue, this is maybe where some of Plato's ideas are the least suited to modern day. But as you said, it doesn't take you don't have to go that far back in history to see a time where these ideas could almost be directly, pasted across and see why people took that view at this time. So Plato argues that the noble should be in charge. They should be a class of rulers. And who makes up this class of rulers? Well, Plato argues that it is, surprise, surprise, philosophers. Now, I know there's a bit of a flaw in this argument in the fact that Plato himself is a philosopher. So is this basically Plato saying, I'm the best guy to rule? It kind of is, and it kind of isn't. So in the Socratic dialogues, I think that's one of the first arguments that's made against Plato. They kind of say, hold up, are you just doing a grab for power here? And he says, no, not me in particular, but we're going to have this class of philosophers that are expert academics. They're going to be raised from birth to rule, and to rule well. So taking it back to your sort of monarchy example, when you have good ones and bad ones, even throughout history, if you look at the kings and queens of England, maybe some of the best kings and queens were those who were molded for leadership, or were always like, when you were born as a prince or a princess at that time, if people knew that you were the next in line to the throne, you'd go through like intensive like education on how to rule and protocol and what you should do. And maybe some of the worst leaders, or those who were less conventional, were those who unexpectedly came into the role rather than those that were trained from birth.
I get that idea that they're trained from birth, but I think that kind of does tie into the point I was making, where we understand that given the correct training, any person could do anything. In the past, people were born to that kind of role, and they were trained up in that role. And kind of the difference we're saying is that nowadays we'd say, well, if you trained anyone to be a politician, they could be a great politician.
That's a really good point. That's something that Plato deals with when he's talking about the more like minutiae of how these states are built. His ideas are a bit mad, and I'll go into detail about them later, because I think when Plato goes into like the nitty gritty of his ideas, it really breaks down, and you think, what is this weird society that seems to have come out of like The Prisoner or some sort of like weird documentary like that? You just think this is nothing like this has existed on Earth. But his idea was, it was a bit of a meritocracy. He says that you kind of train everybody up, you at least train people up to be rulers, and then they're assessed. And then about the age of 50, those people who have proven themselves to be good enough academics or good enough people to rule the state, then they get put into the role of leader. So you will get the best person for the job. It's not just about being born into that role and sort of like, whoever you are, your dad just happens to be king, you're the king. That's an imperfect system in Plato's mind. Plato imagines that it will come from a pool of people. But where you get this pool of people to start from, or where you'd get these children to train up in the first place, is always a big question mark. And it's kind of one of the fundamental problems when you're dealing with philosophy, is that you start with these big noble ideals, and if you take them in a vacuum, it kind of sounds like it makes sense that the best trained person becomes leader, and it makes sense that the best trained people would have been trained from birth. But is it practical to raise the whole nation in that way? Probably not. So where are you going to get your first children to try out this philosopher program? It's probably going to be from the nobles, because they're the people who have the most money and the most time, and you've already ruled that nobles are the best suited to ruling. Why would you take a farmer's kid or a warrior's kid? So yeah, Plato is still monarchy in a way, but a bit more of a democratic, maybe not democratic, but more of like a meritocracy within the noble class, if that makes sense. One of the other reasons that Plato is stresses education, and we've touched on this a bit, is that Plato has a fundamentally negative view of human nature. How you view humans, and if you think that humans are intrinsically good or intrinsically bad, is something that comes up again and again and again through politics, and is kind of the divide between the right and the left, if I was making it very simplistic. In general, those on the right of politics think that humans are fundamentally bad-natured. They're bad people, they do bad things, therefore they need strong laws to keep them in control. Meanwhile, those on the left say that, hey, humans are social creatures, they're good people. If you just leave them to their own devices, they'll do good things. Plato thinks that humans are negative, and has examples of the corruption of politicians that he draws on, saying that people are naive, they're influenced by outside factors, and that makes a human imperfect. It's only because, people tend to only be just because they obey laws and because they lack physical power to perform criminal acts, and they're afraid of punishment. Plato also thinks, on the other hand, that if you get a person and train them through birth and through education, humans also have a capacity to be rational and good, and that if political society is ordered properly, then you can build up a society of good morals, and the state will mold people into being good as long as they have a good political order, good education, and a good upbringing. That all produces these good natures. So if you take the temptations of the outside world away, then you create this perfectly good citizen who acts in the interests of the common good and becomes the perfect ruler. So I guess what I wanted to ask you at this stage is, what temptations would you remove if you were sort of training this ultimate ruler? this like super kid from birth, what are you going to take away to make sure that he always thinks about the best for the state and not about what he wants personally?
What things I would take away from people to encourage them to become the perfect leaders?
Yeah. So you're going to rid them of like temptation. Like personal example, when I was studying for my GCSEs, I took my PlayStation away from myself to make sure that I wasn't tempted to play too much.
Distractions?
Yeah. Things that make people remember that Plato is talking about things that make people think in their own self-interest and not for the common good. So what do you think are temptations that make people like be self-interested rather than work for the betterment of society?
Well, I imagine, I suppose this is not necessarily answering for myself, because I feel that, basically I don't agree that you should restrict,
that's absolutely fine. Yeah.
People things. Yeah, that's my basic thing. But I'm going to try and guess the kind of things that will get brought up. So considering he is Plato, as in the Platonic love and all of that, I imagine sex is right off the table, right? Because, there's this long-standing thing. You look at the Jedi and other fictional kind of like characters that are monk-like. That's the first thing they're like, I'll take that away. That's a distraction. Like if you want to be closer to God, or in this case, closer to doing something for other people. Although personally, I don't think that having a load of sexually frustrated men running things is going to be a good idea. And then I'm trying to think what other things would be on his list. I mean, I kind of imagine it's just going to be a general kind of group of sins of the flesh, like don't be too gluttonous, don't have fancy food, that kind of thing. Because obviously they didn't have video game consoles back then.
What's the root of all evil?
Oh, money. Yeah. So you want to keep them away from money. I mean, I suppose there is a kind of, if you could argue, if you're trying to develop, I suppose this like fully automated luxury gay space communism that is Star Trek. Like in Star Trek, they don't have the concept of money anymore, right? That they're just beyond that because they can replicate anything they ever need. Although confusingly, there is the concept of credits. It's a bit kind of hypocritical, but that's. But like I suppose, yeah, if you said like you set these people up in this institution where they're going to learn and they need not want for anything, I suppose would be a good thing to say. Like they don't need to worry about where their next meal's coming from because they are being trained in education, and you'd like to think that would eventually be the baseline for all society. But like if you were saying we're working on this specific group of people to make them into a ruling class, presumably that would be an argument that would be put forward.
Yeah, no, that's really good, and that's really good for thinking like Plato would be. So like the main thing he takes away are private property. So you can't have mansions, you can't have big houses, that'll corrupt you. Or family life. So I guess that builds into you're no sex. Even he's saying that if you have a family that you value like their welfare more than the welfare of the state, that's going to corrupt you, or at least tempt you to work in their interests rather than that of the state. So even though they are rulers, he says they'll receive only modest remuneration from the state. They'll dine in common dining halls. They'll have wives and children in common. Which might be a little bit like, hey, free love, but also, kind of states that they're not going to be attached too much to one person. They are themselves the state. If you're embodying the state, then you have to act in a way befitting of the state. You can't show favoritism towards one person because they're your wife, or one person because they're your child. Plato believes that, if these philosopher rulers were to acquire private land, luxurious homes, and money themselves, they would become hostile masters of other citizens, rather than their leaders and allies. So that's all of Plato's ideas, sort of in the whole. And once, I've said before, that that sounds like maybe okay in general, or in a vacuum, you're like, yeah, wouldn't it be nice if our leader didn't have a big house, or, was just a normal person and didn't have to, wouldn't put family first. He'd just put the best ideas of the state and put them for me. But he goes off the rails a bit about how this would actually be done. So he essentially says that children will be taken right after birth from their parents and essentially will be raised by the state. So the state will be the father of the child, and their peers their siblings. The children will be trained with gymnastics and will be raised with anthems which will instill state love to mind of children.
I mean, this is sounding very kind of communist, but when I say communist, I mean like the kind of communism we got in Soviet Russia.
Yeah, like the bad communism, like there's almost no individuality. It's so much about the state. It's consuming. Songs with nonsense lyrics should be forbidden, and music should not alienate people from state and gods. There is no need for too much melodies. A few is just enough. Gymnastics train the body and music trains the soul. Therefore, the most beneficial music must be found, and people must only listen to that, and they must not change. And then, later he says that after these children have been raised by the state, or in his case, by these crazy gymnasts, and listening to the same ABBA tracks every day, then you'll pick the best leader who's been educated from the age of 50, and they will be the philosopher kings. He also believes other things like fear of death in humans must be eradicated, so brave men do not hesitate to die for the state when it is necessary. And he's really, really obsessed about gymnastics, saying that, I guess in his idea, it's a way to promote good health and, sort of preventing disease and making sure people can focus on their work without having to be restrained by their own physical limitations. He also gets quite, fascist in a way here, of saying that there's no benefit to curing inborn patients. We must leave them to death. The ones with congenitally bad bodies and souls must die.
I mean, that is kind of a Greek thing, though. Like, if you look back into the myths, there's a lot of, I'm just going to abandon my baby on the mountain and let him finish. Like, the kind of idea that if you survive... I mean, I suppose it's like a very early concept of survival of the fittest.
Spartan,
right?
Isn't it? Yeah, it's like the Spartan thing was to leave the baby on the mountain, wasn't it? If it was imperfect.
Yeah.
And even you've seen 300, haven't you?
I think, yeah.
With the whole point, one of the morals of that story, or one of the Greek morals, if you're taking from it, is that the person who betrays the Spartans is a child that was horribly deformed and imperfect, and was therefore able to be corrupted by the Persians, and that led to their downfall, which reinforces the Spartan belief that you've got to be perfect and you have to be a perfect warrior. We'd have a very different view nowadays, but that's the type of message that the Greeks were promoting. So I think you can see from, when it gets into the minutiae of Plato's ideas, they become very, ancient Greek in their model, and they're less relatable to what we can have nowadays, or what would be feasible nowadays. And that kind of shows one of the big problems with political philosophy as a whole, when these grand ideas kind of sound okay in passing, or in an argument, but when you start probing too deep and go into how it'll actually be practical, I find that Plato's ideas at least break down for me.
And I think that is probably true of a lot of it. You get, I mean, we talked earlier about problems in democracy, right? But whenever you start to talk about a better, quote unquote, political system, that people can suggest very good ideas on the face of it, but it's once you try and actually make things a reality that things get difficult. There are a lot of people who I think would say that communism is a great idea on paper, but every version of it we've seen has been entirely corrupt and awful. There's a lot of this kind of stuff with political theory where it's this would be just great if people didn't act like people, and money didn't corrupt, and all these other things that are real parts of real life, and kind of deciding political ideas in a vacuum in a philosophical kind of way might not be that applicable to real life.
So with that in mind, I'm going to move straight on to Aristotle, who is a student of Plato and has a very different idea. And I mentioned it earlier, but the thing about Aristotle is he tries to take the ideas of Plato but make them more practical. That's his idea. Aristotle was very much like a man of science, and he didn't, or ancient Greek science, I'm going to use that very wide term because scientific thought didn't come until much later, but he at least did some of the data gathering and tried to say, look, I like your principles, but I'm mostly going to relate things to what I see in real life, and what I can observe around me is how I'm going to be informed is how I'm going to make sure that's the best decision for humans. Maybe I'll try and make that sentence again. Aristotle is very focused in what you can see, taste, and hear. If he sees a good example of something working, he'll say, right, I'll use that as my example and try and work out why that works, rather than thinking, this thing is good. This thing is just the best, and that's why I'm following it. As we've seen, Plato's all about these grand ideas that break down when you actually put them under a microscope. Hopefully Aristotle's ideas will hold up a little better, or do so in my opinion, but that's my classic Aristotle bias coming through. I'm sure you've met many like me on the street. Aristotle has an idea of that there are basically 6 types of regimes that exist in the world, or the ancient Greek world at that time. But I think they're generally applicable nowadays. So you've got rule by one man, rule by a few men, or the rich, or rule by many, which is the poor. And there is a good type and bad type of each. So I'm going to list the 6 types. You're going to tell me which one you think is ruled by one man, which one's ruled by a few men, and which one's ruled by many. And then I'm going to ask you if you can identify the good type and bad type of each of those. So we've got pens and paper at the ready, those listening at home. Monarchy, tyranny, oligarchy, polity, aristocracy, and democracy. So which one do you think is ruled by one man out of those 6?
Well, so you said there was 2 of each, right?
There's 2 of each. So yeah, there's 2. Which 2 of those would be ruled by one man?
Well, royalty, obviously, because there is a monarch who is the absolute ruler, and tyranny, which would be, like we're saying with dictators, someone who is a tyrant.
Which do you think is the good and the bad type?
Well, I'm assuming the tyrant would be the bad one.
Yep.
Because, like, especially in olden days, they're like, oh, you're king by virtue of God or gods. Well, I mean, I suppose in Greek myth, it's normally they are like a demigod anyway. Most of the kings were like, oh, Zeus was my dad a long way back.
And so the difference between a monarchy, if I just say good and bad, if you think that Aristotle is a student of Plato, what do you think Aristotle's basing a good system of government and what makes a bad system of government? I
mean, I suppose it's similar to what we're saying, like the idea that they get perverted by one particular, like the idea that if you have a wife or whatever, then you put her interests ahead of you. So presumably the idea is that, like, the monarch, while on their own, is trying to rule for the good of their country, whereas the tyrant only cares about themselves.
Perfect. Yeah, that's spot on. So let's move on to the next one. So rule by a few men or the rich. Which 2 regimes do you think fit into that category, and which one's the good one and which one's the bad one?
So I'm assuming that's aristocracy, which is a few nobles, and then oligarchy. Is that the other one?
Yep, that's the other one. And
yep.
Which do you think is the good and the bad one here?
Again, same argument. I mean, he's going to be pro-aristocracy because the nobles are kind of, in the same way, descended from gods or God, and the rich are going to be entirely fueled by money, so oligarchy's bad.
Perfect. So finally, that leaves us with our last 2, which is polity and democracy, which is ruled by the many or the poor. Which one of these 2 do you think he thinks is the best form of government, and which is the least good?
So I assume it's going to be that the polity is the better one, because I suppose, like the argument we had before from Plato, of democracy being bad because those people aren't necessarily made to be rulers. So again, it's kind of the same argument. If we have a political class who have been trained to be politicians, then they will rule well for all of the people.
Bosh, you got it in one. You didn't fall into my trap and say democracy is the best. So congratulations. You've passed the first test. Finally, he ranks all 6 of these from the best to the worst. So how do you think, would you have your own ranking? And how do you think Aristotle would rank these? So
ranking all 6, or just
ranking all
he thinks the best one?
Like ranking all 6 and thinking, like, which one? Let's go with Aristotle's first. So which system of leadership do you think Aristotle thinks is the best, and which one do you think, like, going down to the worst out of all of those 6?
I mean, I think essentially it's going to go. I think it's so we've got a graph, we've got like a grid now in the chat. And I think it's going to be the best is the one that he considers generally good with the many. So it's going to be polity is best. And I imagine it's going to go from right to left and then right to left again. So I think he's going to say polity is the best, aristocracy next best, monarchy third best, then democracy 4th, oligarchy 5th, and tyranny the worst.
Close. So Aristotle goes monarchy, aristocracy, polity, democracy, oligarchy, tyranny.
Oh, okay. So he thinks one person ruling is better than many.
Yes, essentially. His theory behind this is a bit like Plato's. It's very similar. He says that if you have one person who is wholly good, who is a super citizen, who knows what everybody thinks, that's the most efficient way of ruling. That's like the one where they're really less corruptible. If you had like Jesus, I don't know, like if you had somebody at that level who's just running things and they're the best, then they're gonna be the best. But equally, if you have one person and they're the worst, then they're the hardest to get out of power. They stay in power the longest. They can cause far much damage because of it. That's why he puts tyranny right down at the bottom of the scale, if that makes sense. So, yeah, no, close. And I assume if you were to rank these, I mean, like, I would probably put democracy the highest. I would probably rank it as you did, really. Like, I would rank you as Aristotle, like as you suggested, Aristotle.
So I mean, I'm assuming here the difference, like, democracy here seems like the idea is that like everyone rules, as opposed to it's not 100% clear. I think it's because they're like, oh, democracy is rule of the poor, but presumably polity is actually more like what we actually have, some kind of government where we elect leaders. So yeah, the difference in this way. The difference between democracy and polity is really hard to kind of, because you can imagine one good person in a monarchy and one bad person as a tyrant. Like, that's really easy to conceive. And you can imagine one group of wealthy people in a aristocracy being nice and the oligarchies like corrupt corporations. And polity is a word that we hardly ever use anyway. The key thing here is to think of like whose interests are they acting in. So a polity acts in the common good of the state and is run by the poor. That's the only difference between a polity and a democracy, is that they're running it for the good of the state. Meanwhile, in a democracy, he says that those people are just doing it for their own good. We've probably talked about it before on this podcast, the tyranny of the majority, right? That those people will be, although they're the majority and they're in charge, they will act in their own self-interest. So essentially, in a representative democracy, we're actually near a polity by that kind of description, where we're electing people who are supposed to be working in the interest of everyone, but they're not like, it's not like we're literally asking everyone's opinion all the time on everything, which would be like death by committee.
Yes, precisely. I think that's a very fair comparison to make. If again you want to go for that jump and say, are politicians really acting in our self-interests, like in their own self-interest, or not?
I mean, in an idealized form.
Yeah, precisely. So, hey, this is political. This is philosophical chat. This is like, everything can be queried and broken down. It's great, but so that's how Aristotle ranks them, like in a raw sense. But then he goes a step further than Plato, and he goes, right, now what's actually a practically better regime to run? Aristocracy, like, is the best, but as we've pointed out before, you get good kings and you get bad kings, essentially.
So monarchy is the best according to him.
Monarchy is the best, but if you get it wrong, then it quickly becomes the worst type of government that you can have. The difference between a good king and a bad king is really shocking. Meanwhile, the difference between polity and democracy actually isn't that much. So Aristotle says, in practical terms, we should actually aim to have this polity where the poor rule, because if it goes wrong, it's not going to go that bad. And he's got another few things to say about this. He sees polity again in ancient Greek terms of farmers ruling. He says that they're the best to rule because farmers won't have time to come to the assembly to talk about laws and change them. So essentially, they just let the laws govern themselves, and this is enough. Which you can probably see the flaws in that argument from like a modern day standpoint.
Yeah, and I think it's the perfect example is I don't know if you've seen the very good movie On the Basis of Sex.
I haven't, I'm afraid, but
I'd very much recommend it. It's the story of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the Supreme Court Justice in the US.
Oh yes, I think I have seen bits of that. Yeah, sorry, carry on. She's amazing.
It's very good, and the basic concept is it's a legal drama as well as being a story of her life, but it's she is one of the first female lawyers to go to Harvard, and then like constantly through her life, despite that, people are still like being misogynistic towards her, etc., and all of that. But then she realizes there's this case where a man is being unfairly affected by laws that assume that all caregivers are women, and therefore he's committed tax fraud by trying to claim a tax benefit for looking after his mother instead of working. And then it's all about how they use that to kind of prove in general terms that it's unfair to make any decision on the basis of sex within the legal system. But a lot of that is people being like, yeah, but this has been the law for so long and the law is correct. Like, this is precedent you're going up against. And then her point is obviously, well, let's make a new precedent because this is wrong. But yeah, I think that's like the main flaw there, is the idea that every law that exists is already perfect. And if you just let the laws run, then the world will be perfect. Because, you know, we all know that most laws are just one like basic law with a load of like footnotes being like, except in this situation, because you can't write a perfect law first time.
Exactly. And like, I think Aristotle skips over the point of who makes these laws as well. Like, I can't remember where he says, like, oh, these people should set the laws and that's what makes them good. They are always open to interpretation. You very rightly pointed out, you know, the notorious RBG, and how the US Supreme Court is constantly arguing over like the interpretation of the Constitution and what rights that has. And that's been a battle for over 250 years. Aristotle tries to like say there will be a Supreme Court or the equivalent. He says that we'll make sure the laws stay just by, like, when there are disputes, we'll have juries and they'll be made up of equal parts of the poor, the middle class and the rich, just to make sure they don't gang up on each other. However, in practical terms, or at least in historical terms, when I look at it, there's a very good example within the French Revolution. Have you studied the French Revolution much, or have
let's just say I have read about it on Wikipedia.
Yes,
like I've done a fairly deep Wikipedia dive. I mean, I knew bits and bobs here and there, but it's not something I studied at school. And then, obviously, I wanted to know the context of Les Miserables, and then I read about the revolution, because obviously Les Miserables is actually set in the failed revolution. So that's inherently interesting in and of itself. But yes, I have done some reading, but, you know, I couldn't necessarily make some deep political thoughts based on it.
I respect that all of your historical research is for the basis of understanding musical theatre. I have solidarity with that point. Very, very quickly, in the French Revolution, or one of the things that started the French Revolution, is that you had like a 3-part system in France where you had like the nobles, the clergy, and everybody else. And when there was a big problem in France, the king all called them to a parliament and said, how should we solve this great economic problem with France? This is the first time we've got everybody together, like all of the people who represent the poor, those who represent the clergy, and those who represent the nobility. We're going to sort out how we're going to have this, like, fix our big economic crisis. And so they all had a vote. But the problem was that the nobles had a vote of 1, the clergies had a vote of 1, and the poor had a vote of 1, even though the poor made up a far bigger part of the population than the nobles or the clergy. So every time it came to a vote saying, oh, who should pay more taxes? The clergy and the nobles ganged up and said, we think the poor should do it. And essentially the poor lost every vote, but they were the greatest in terms of number. That's a very shorthand way of saying how the French Revolution starts, is because the poor were like messed over in that way. So there are clear flaws in Aristotle's problem, and I think one of these flaws is based on the fact that he sees the middle part, like the middle class, as the best class of all, the least corruptible. He sees that, like, the middle class are, like, they're the ones most likely to listen to reason. They're the heart of the economy. They're not going to want anything to go too bad if it's bad for business. Meanwhile, the rich and the poor are always in conflict, and the rich will always organise something to take advantage of the poor, and the poor will always take advantage of the rich. They'll always govern in their own self-interest to try and improve their stake. Meanwhile, those in the middle won't. They'll try and balance things out. And this is, I don't want to go into Aristotle's ethics, but very briefly, he always thought that there's like a mean virtue of everything. You can't be, let me see if I can grab some examples of Aristotle's virtues. I said I wasn't going to go into this, but now I'm like, I need the examples.
He has too little, too much, and a virtuous mean.
Yes, the virtuous mean is what Aristotle is all about. You have good temper rather than spiritlessness, which is too little, or inscrutability, which is too much. Civility is in the middle. Meanwhile, rudeness is too little civility, and obsequiousness is, an excess. Good words. So Aristotle's all about this golden mean, so that I think there's no wonder that he kind of sees the middle classes as the saviour, and I think in practical politics, that isn't always the case. The French Revolution is a very broad example of how the middle class can gang up with the rich to screw over the poor, essentially. And I think a lot of people would argue in modern politics that might be the way that things go. So we've got a lot of points there from Aristotle, but essentially he says we should get a polity that's run by farmers, or if not by farmers, then it's run by the middle class that kind of act on behalf of the farmers and will protect everything. Essentially, I think that, like, in conclusion, I see Aristotle as the more practical from Plato. He never gets too into these weird ideas of gymnasts or a super state. He's very much working with what he's got in front of him.
I love how there's just the undercurrent of gymnasts with Plato.
To wrap this all up, I'm just going to compare some similarities between Plato and Aristotle, and then maybe we can have an argument about which one's the best. I think I'm going the way of Aristotle, but that's me. So the similarities between Plato and Aristotle, it's clear that they're students of each other, and they're very set in that, society has three parts. And I think that model has survived the test of time, at least the fact that it's split into three parts. Maybe not the definitions that they gave them, because society has moved on in different ways, but the fact that we have those at the bottom, those at the top, and those in the middle is something that's still applicable to everyday life. I feel that maybe the questionable exception here is American politics, where they were set up, their democracy set up quite late, and their constitution is written quite late, and the whole idea of their democracy is to try and eliminate this upper class. They're not coming from a history of kings, or they don't want to instill a monarchy. They were one of the first states to say, right, we can really start afresh here and see what we can do, and we don't have to rely on an old monarchy system. We don't necessarily have to. I know there's the American Revolution where they overthrow a king, but they try and eliminate that class altogether. But I still think that you can probably argue that there is a super rich class within the United States.
Capitalism doesn't have a king, but they have people who are possibly who are definitely far richer than kings.
Exactly. Yeah. Then both believe that sort of the best states act in the interest of the common good. They're all about you can't have somebody working in their own self-interest. You can't have somebody obsessed about family or money. It's all got to be about these higher ideals, the idea of justice and making sure everyone's provided for. Kind of a bit more of it is more socialism in a way, what they're promoting in what the state should do and provide for its citizens. Not a capitalist greed thing. We can go into this way more later if we talk about other philosophers, if we continue this series, because, hey, guess what? Marx has a lot of things to say about capitalism. But in their whole, they're thinking that the state should act in the interest of all its citizens, and that's a very kind of ancient Greek small state ideal. It might not play up to the realities of what we think of the country today, but that's what they were doing at the time. And both of them kind of believe that at their core, one person ruling in the common good is the best form of leadership. Where their views differ, however, is firstly on that point is Aristotle says, although it's good, that's impractical. The best practical form is polity, where democracy, if it goes good, then it's fine. And if it goes bad, it's not that bad either. So it's better than having a tyranny. So let's do everything we can to avoid the worst state. And I think Aristotle's definition of the three classes, the rich, the poor, and the middle, is far more realistic than Plato's idealized farmers, warriors, and philosophers, which you kind of never have enough philosophers, or having warriors replacing that economic middle class is something that's not very, that again is not practical, and having them as a section state of society is kind of your weird super state rather than Aristotle's more practical one. So yeah, that's a philosophy 101. That's the very basis of statescraft and how you start to form a society. You think about who should rule, what makes a perfect state, and in particular, who should rule it and why, and what the format is. And I can't remember if we've done it on previous ones where we've it's always a good political experiment to say, you've landed on a desert island, you can start fresh.
A desert island politics, yeah.
Yeah, how are you gonna run this? So this idea of who runs it is at the core of political philosophy and is still really important from ancient Greece up till now. If we continue this series, I want to go into more things more on human nature, which is something that comes across sort of in just at the form of the Enlightenment, and then you get into more you get into the birth of the ideas where you've got the birth of liberalism amongst people like John Stuart Mill and my personal favourite, Jeremy Bentham.
Oh, yes.
You get to you move away from the idea that the state is the most important thing to the idea that the individual is the most important thing. And that's maybe one of the biggest political shifts that happens over time. But if we're starting with our state, our country, then this is it. This is what we're dealing with now. So I hope you enjoyed like a little delve into political philosophy. I hope my questions weren't too taxing.
Yeah, no, it's good. It's nice to kind of, in fairness, it's mostly sitting back and listening to you teach me some philosophy, which I am not opposed to. I hope our listeners agree that this was interesting. You can find us in all the places you usually find us. You can find us at parliamentary.observer, where you can come and comment on our episodes. You can find us on YouTube. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram and Reddit. You can find us, you'll find us on Instagram and Twitter as @Unparl_podcast. You'll find us on Reddit as /r/unparliamentary, and you'll find us on Facebook as Unparliamentary Language. Also, if you want to support us, throw a few dollars our way, you can go to patreon.com/TTSS. Yeah, if you want to come along and listen in the chat, join us on Discord, chat with us. Basically, it would be great to know if you want more from this series. I know I'm interested in learning more about this, so I feel like there is definitely a will on the podcast side of things, but it's always good to hear from people that this is the kind of thing they want to listen to during silly season. I think we've got 2 more silly season episodes we're going to try and get out before the realities of real life come crashing back down in September. But no, I thought that was interesting. Like I say, I knew bits about Plato and Aristotle, but not much. And I suppose actually philosophy is probably something I haven't really got in my podcasts. I listen to a lot of podcasts, and philosophy isn't one of them. Thanks as always, Rob, for joining me and for teaching me something I didn't know.
That's all right, no problem. I feel like if I think back to how my philosophy teachers tried to get it to me, I feel they use much sort of like higher and grander language. I tend to use if I'm breaking it down too much, let me know, but I really like the idea of
that's fine. It's not a thing I understand formal logic and a few things like that because I've used them in like mathematical contexts, but like philosophical terms, I remember a lot of people reading philosophy books who are friends of mine, and it's like, oh, well, this sentence goes on for several pages, and I feel that's one of the problems with philosophy. Like, it's interesting to get into, but it's the concepts that are interesting, not the way it's written.
Certainly, yeah.
You mentioned Karl Marx earlier, and I was reading the other day through a list of prompts for the game Vampire the Masquerade, and one of them is Karl Marx was transformed into a vampire before his death by a Bruyère admirer, but due to a complication in his embrace, immediately succumbed to torpor. On the eve of civil unrest in London, he rises from his grave in Highgate Cemetery, which just sounds like such a fun concept for a role-playing game.
I'd say I would be involved in that adventure. If Marx is there, I'm all over
it. And with that, I suppose there's nothing else to say other than it's good night from me.
And it's a good night from him. Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.
I am speaking into the void, and have been doing so for 2 minutes. Oh dear.